Hello there, and welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio, where our motto is that we should question authority wherever it comes from, whoever it is, and at all times. Not because of wanting to promote anarchy, but basically because we need to be able to keep those who are in power in check, which is something our founding fathers wanted. In fact, that's why we have a system in which it's so hard to pass legislation. That's the reason why the founding fathers set up divided government. The way you learned about it, remember, in your social studies class, where you had the executive, you had the congressional, and then you had the judicial. And then even, depending on your teacher, they may have thrown in the fourth branch that sort of came along with it, and that being the media. That was really good up until the end of the 20th century, and now look what we've got. We've got a president who just through executive orders basically makes legislation. You've got a Congress that rolls over and plays dead, better analogy. The Republican leadership in the Congress, basically, if Obama throws a stick, they fight each other to go fetch that stick and come back and with their tails between their legs and handing it to him. I mean, it's really frustrating. And then the judicial, well, they're kind of slow on things, and unfortunately, a lot of the appointments are political, so therefore, your interpretation of the Constitution is going to be swayed because it's going to be the politics of the person that's in the judiciary. Of course, that's not really something new. But then the media, come on. We've got 6 giant mega corporations that control basically everything that comes out in the media, except for the alternative media. And, when they're kind of in sync with the government, there's something that's called, there's a type of government that you have when the government and the media and all of the major corporations and even unions and stuff pretty much go along to get along. And I don't want to bring up images of Mussolini and his style of government, which was, what was that called, fascism? But, the United States seems to be kind of going that direction. And with these police that you see, you could look at YouTube. I mean, I just recently watched a video of some cops breaking up a demonstration in Berkeley. Now, I'm not someone who agrees with what the Berkeley protesters were standing for. Okay? I'm not in agreement with them. But you know what? I'd rather live in a country where people can protest peacefully and, be able to express themselves. And I don't care what their stands are on issues. I don't care. If they want to hold a protest in favor of, going naked in public, fine. Let them run naked, especially in the wintertime. We'll see how far that gets them. But I like the idea of following the Constitution where it says the right of the people to peacefully assemble shall not be infringed. Okay? They don't need a bunch of cops that look like they just stepped out of, what's the name of that movie? Equilibrium with Christian Bale. They don't have to look like peacekeepers, except they're dressed in black, from the Hunger Games. They don't have to, we don't have to have that sort of thing. But when you have cops that are yelling, move, 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 and pushing people and stuff, that's just unnecessary in a free society. Especially when we look at the cops, you see, the media. Notice how the media portrays the cops in China dealing with the Hong Kong protests, and you take a look at how they handle the protest. I mean, most of these cops look like they're dressed up for a Boy Scout convention. The ones in Hong Kong, the Chinese communist cops, they're not dressed up like they just stepped out of a dystopian movie. Yet we're seeing increasingly our cops look like they're trying out for the new Star Wars movie. Hey, I'm a better stormtrooper than you. I mean, this is ridiculous. That's not what I'm going to really talk about a lot here. Of course, it does tie in with the topic I'm dealing with. And ultimately, it is the situation when it comes to Russia. Now, the thing is, this does tie in. I mean, every issue that's facing us right now does have a tie-in. But I'm going to primarily start out with dealing what's going on with Russia, then some of the background, and then I would like to go into maybe why we're seeing what we're seeing today when it comes to this kind of, welcome to 1984 scenario that seems to be coming out here in the USA. Now, first of all, one of the things that caught my eye recently was the House passed a bill, or I should say a resolution. A resolution is not a binding piece of law. A resolution is something that says, here's how we feel about things. But the thing is that it is a statement. And when you make a statement, it's intended to be heard by whoever, whatever you're aiming at. And the House Resolution 758 basically rips on Russia big time, blaming Russia for just about everything. I'm surprised they're not blaming Russia for the fall of Atlantis, although I'm sure that if you give them enough time, they'll find a tie-in there. Or were the Russians involved in the sinking of the Maine? Or did they have something to do with what happened to Lincoln? What was the Tsar doing back there in those days? And what was his relationship to Abraham Lincoln? But this is, if you just read it, you can go on the internet, just type in House Resolution 758. Now, this is a resolution that is basically slapping Russia in the face, blaming it for what's going on in Ukraine, even taking shots at what's going on with Russians supporting Bashar Assad in Syria. Now, again, those of you that listen to this program or listen to alternative media in general, you got an advantage. You probably know where Syria is. When you mention things about Saudi Arabia, you know where Saudi Arabia is. The average American today does not know these things. All right? Even a lot of our elected representatives, if you ask them to find these countries on a world map, they can't do it. And I've seen examples where elected representatives, one from Oregon, was once asked, can you find Bosnia on the world map? When he just voted on some policies dealing with Bosnia. Couldn't do it. And it wasn't a physical map. It was a political map, where the countries are written in. I mean, this is where we're at right now with the United States. The problem is, it seems that we're sort of going the way that a lot of other civilizations have gone in the past. We're going the way of the Roman Empire. We're going the way of... Well, let me pull back and just kind of focus on the Roman Empire. A lot of people are unaware of the fact that the Roman Empire survived a lot longer than they may think. There was the Western Roman Empire, which, if you actually look at it, and I hope that you would, type into Google, type in climate change, fall of Roman Empire. You'll find some very interesting factors there. But in the Western Roman Empire, you had a situation where the elite had become self-serving. The birth rate amongst the what you would call the middle class of Rome was dismally low. Okay? The people that considered themselves Romans within this empire was decreasing rapidly. At the same time, they couldn't secure their borders to the north. They were being attacked from all sides, including because of the global climate change that was occurring then. they were getting, there was peoples being pushed from other groups of, more powerful peoples in the East were pushing to take land and resources from people in the West, and many of those people were flooding into the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. And I'm not saying this to say, oh my gosh, we need to pass carbon credits and stuff. No. What I'm actually saying is that climate change has been occurring for a lot of years. When the Vikings originally went to Greenland, it was a nice place. Okay? It was inhabitable. You could grow crops there that Scandinavians were used to growing. Iceland, of course, people were able to go there and colonize. But when the climate got colder, then the Viking colonies in Greenland collapsed. And they wouldn't change their ways. They wouldn't adapt to what the Inuits were doing to survive. So the people either died or migrated away. But the point is, if you even look at what we would consider modern history in the last 1,500 years, there have been factors of the climate getting warmer, getting colder. That's just throwing that in there, just to throw that in there as a side note. But anyway, the Roman system was collapsing, and again, corruption, families falling apart, and that sort of thing. And it wasn't so much that this is something I think a lot of Christians mess up on, because they'll say, look, they stopped being religious. Actually, they had converted to Christianity, at least in name. The Roman Catholic Church was in charge, and it was a state religion. The problem was that you had a decline again in demographics. All right? I mean, a pagan population that's growing and is educated is going to survive better than a Christian population that is shrinking and declining in education. I mean, Christianity is just the religion factor was just a variable. It has nothing to do with, they became, this and then suddenly this happened. It was a variable dealing with demographics. In the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, that was the eastern part. They had divided the Roman Empire. You had a situation where the Byzantines and Persians were constantly battling each other. At the same time, of course, the Byzantines are having to deal with incursions and fights along their western borders too. But their main focus was on their eastern borders. The big competition in those days was Persia and the Eastern Roman Empire. And what was interesting was they weakened themselves through their fighting. Think about this. The West versus the East. They weakened themselves because of their fighting and various political intrigue, and also the Byzantine Empire, because of having to maintain armies and so forth, same with the Persians, they would raise taxes on the various subjugated peoples that they had, or citizens too. And the thing is that these people became increasingly resentful to the authority that was at that time in Constantinople. And so when Muhammad started his quest to spread Islam and to raise armies and started to push against the Christian areas of the Middle East and North Africa, many of those areas just went ahead and said, yeah, whatever, and gave in to his armies without fight. And because they didn't see that the system they had was any better than the system that the Byzantines were running. And maybe they thought that at least with Muhammad and promises of his military and his people, that they would try to follow some sort of code of ethics that might be better. You see that with civilizations all the time. Someone comes along and says, I'm the solution. And people go for it if things are bad enough. And the thing is, because the Byzantines and the Persians had had been fighting for so many years and drained themselves, Muhammad's armies were able to overcome the Persians and take most of what the Byzantines had. And eventually, under Mehmet, they were able to finally defeat the Byzantines. And that's why if you go into Istanbul today, you can visit the Eye of Sophie. I think now it's a museum. It had been the seat of Eastern Christianity. And then when the Muslims took over, they turned it into a mosque. I've been there before. Oh, fantastic architecture for that period. It was built like the 4th or 5th century. The doorways, the doors, everything huge. And I guess originally they had beautiful murals, but when the Muslims came in, they felt that was idol worship. So they scraped away all of the murals, except for, I remember this, up on the wall, there's a picture of Mary with Jesus. And they felt that since they revered Mary and Jesus of course being a prophet, they left that. But they took out everything else. But the thing is, because of their fighting, this ended the Byzantines. This ended the Persian Empire as we know it. And, eventually, over the years, the peoples found it economically and socially, or maybe religiously, positive to convert to Islam from Christianity and Judaism. And this is what brings us to the world today. Now, during the 1960s, the 1970s, 1980s, the West and the East were involved, in East being, of course, Russia, China, the Warsaw Pact, were also involved in a competition that really does remind me of the Byzantines versus the Persians. And this competition meant that they had to raise armies to protect themselves. Now, I do have to say that I don't have the perspective anymore that the Soviets were raising military so they could just swarm over us and take us over. I mean, if you look at what was really going on in these countries, it seemed to be more defensive. Now, of course, they were promoting communism, no doubt about that. But they weren't, just looking for that little weakness to then exploit, and then all of a sudden, you got the sickle and hammer flying over Buckingham Palace in London. Now, the thing is that both sides believed the other side was going to take them over. So what they did was they spent enormous amounts of money building weaponry that would prevent them from being taken over. Now, in the Soviet Union, that meant that their top scientists and much of their money was going to building a first world military with first world technology, but its economy was third world. So if you were to look out on the farmland in the 1970s, you would have people still using horses and plows that were being pulled by horses and that sort of thing to be able to produce food. At the same time, you might have an advanced fleet of MiG fighters flying over on some sort of destination, which I guess would have been the ultimate irony there. People barely able to afford to have shoes, but yet you had a very advanced military and a very advanced space program. On the other hand, in the West, what became the norm during the Vietnam War was if something's unpopular, like the Vietnam War became, then Johnson and then later Nixon decided, let's go ahead and borrow money instead of taxing the citizens. Because if all of a sudden people are seeing bad pictures of what's going on in Vietnam, and you are raising their taxes to pay for this unpopular war, then people are going to get really angry. They were getting angry anyway. At least a segment of the population was getting angry. And so you had a situation in which the government decided, why not just borrow? And of course, then we went into some very interesting economics, especially under Richard Nixon. Now, you want your dollar to be valuable, but at the same time, he ended the pegging of the currency to precious metals. So essentially, the currency was, well, whatever people thought it was. At the same time, he made some deals with the Saudi Arabians in regards to using the dollar as a world currency, that, of course, being the petrodollar. And so if the oil states are wanting to switch their currency into dollars as the common denominator currency in order to do trades with, I don't know, France and England and Australia or any other country, that increases demand for dollars. And that therefore increases the value of the dollar, which means that it's easier to issue bonds, long-term treasury notes, and so forth, in order to earn money to cover debts. And this has basically become the norm for funding for the U.S. government. This is why there is such a high, and it's not even, oh gosh, you don't even want to go into derivatives right now. Just regular money, the U.S. owes trillions. And so that's why you get those figures about, well, if we paid off the deficit, we would have to do it by every American citizen paying a certain amount of money. But the thing is, this has weakened our economy. It has made it to the point where living standards have decreased since 1960. I am sorry. We may have some nicer appliances and cooler looking cars, and we may have TV sets that are flat screen and so forth. But why not compare what a average family had in a husband and wife, and in those days, 4 kids. And what did they have with the husband going to work, often at a factory, the whole Fred Flintstone thing, just loading the lunch pail, hard hat, and going to work. What you had was usually the wife didn't have to work. Okay, it wasn't a matter of necessity. If she wanted to work, I guess she could find a job, but, most didn't. So at least they stayed home when their kids were young. 4 kids, average, in those days, 1960. And the husband went out, and he was able to support a family. And if it was a situation where, like, again, the Flintstones, where, Fred's always in an argument with, what was his name, Mr. Slate or something like that, he could quit his job when he's angry, and he could go out and get another job. Okay, that was very much the norm in the 60s and even in the 70s. Get mad at the boss, go find another job. And, maybe even make more money. The thing is, take a look at what it is today. Remember, 1960, let's fast forward 50 years, which in a historical basis is not that long. Fast forward 50 years. And what do you get? You get, well, a lot of college graduates can't find work, saddled with a huge amount of debt. The birth rate and marriage rate in the United States right now is extremely low. It's at its lowest point ever. And then on top of that, I've actually read a statistic that said the divorce rate's actually gone down, but not because people are more cuddly with each other and willing to forgive their trespasses that they might commit to each other, but because divorce would be too expensive and they'd both wind up without a home. And so a lot of couples are like, well, let's just stick with it and, and see what happens. So the thing is, the U.S. economy, by every measure, is collapsed. Oh, yeah, sure. You know what we have right now? I've mentioned this before. We have a lot of people that are on pensions, Social Security, and retirement accounts and so forth. They at least have an income coming in that enables them to keep their home and at least not be starving. And that's a large portion of the population. People in their 70s and 80s and even 90s. Okay? They're not having to depend on their kids. Ironically, many of their kids are moving back in with them, or their grandkids are moving in with them because they don't have jobs. But at least they have their homes paid for, and they're getting Social Security and pensions and so forth. But then you have a large portion of the population, actually not a large portion. Let's instead deal with the small portion, I'm going to say the 1% that everyone's angry at, but then let's expand that to like the 5%. 5% wealthiest people in America. So I'm not just including the filthy rich people that are, could practically go out and buy a third world country. But the people that have an income, that they're living in the big, nice homes out in the suburbs that look more like castles. But, let's just say 5%. Those people are making more money now. Okay? They have the money to make money. And they're doing okay, for the most part. The rest of the population is scared to death of losing the jobs they have, or they don't have jobs that meet the criteria. Sure, they may be flipping a burger, and therefore, Obama can say, hey, look, the statistics are going better for us now. We got more people employed. Now, we could spend a whole show dealing with how the consumer price index is falsified and all these other, and the unemployment rate's falsified and so forth. But we know, you have neighbors, and that's not just anecdotal. You've got neighbors, family, friends, and so forth that cannot find jobs. Or if they do have a job, it's a job that's way below their skill and it's not enough to support a family. And if you know that, then everyone else does too, except maybe the 5%. And so, obviously, things are not going as well as they should be. Now, what has this got to do with Russia again? Plenty. Because the United States has been on a war economy all the way up to the fall of the Soviet Union and beyond. And when we had a situation, but the thing is, a lot of corporations became very, 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 very wealthy off of government contracts. And they depend on those government contracts to keep going. Many of these are corporations that really have nothing to do. Ultimately, you don't think of them when you hear their name. You don't think of them building military weapons. But in today's modern mega corporation society, you have a corporation that may sell one thing, but then they also manufacture parts. They make to tanks. They may make airplanes for travel, but they also make airplanes for fighting. Car manufacturers may be making tanks. All of these kinds of things. And so, what do you do when there's no longer a Soviet Union? What do you do then? Well, you have to manufacture something that's going to replace the Soviet Union. Otherwise, people are going to be saying, why are we spending all this money on these tanks, airplanes, helicopters, missiles, if there's no one to use them against? That seems atrocious. It's not just making them. It's not just buying them. It's also maintaining them. Okay? It costs a lot to maintain. Why do you think the military is giving all this military stuff to the police? Well, there may be a couple reasons for it. They're a little sinister. But at the very least, the corporations are benefiting, because if the police have a mine-resistant giant truck, when are they going to use that? Yeah, but it makes you feel good. Like, hey, look at our big truck here, Yeah, compensating for, the whole Freudian something else being small. But the thing is that those vehicles cost a lot of money to get the spare parts for. So then, if you are selling all these or giving these really expensive items to police departments, school districts, oh my gosh, park districts, all kinds of, why do they need military hardware? Well, the thing is, they're going to break down. And then you've got to go to the source again, the company, and buy spare parts. That's why, friends, I got to say this. Barack Obama's Cash for Clunkers program, you remember that? They probably don't. 6 years ago, and, most of us forget it. But the Cash for Clunkers program actually hurt American car factories. And it was because when people got rid of old cars, they got rid of an old, Ford or Chevy or something like that, of course, you need to make, it's paid for, but you still had to replace radiators every so often. You had to replace carburetors. You had to replace this and this and this and this and this. Well, who manufactured those parts? The car companies. And so when the car companies suddenly, had all these cars turned in and disposed of, then you had a situation in which many of those people that got rid of an old car and were then encouraged to go out and get a new car, they bought Asian cars, something from other countries. And so therefore, the money that the car company made that they could count on from people just keeping old cars and keeping them running was no longer there. Okay, so that actually hurt the car companies in the long run. That's when good intentions bring forth bad policies and bad results. Now, getting back to the major corporations. Now, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, the older George Bush, had promised the Soviets, and later, when the Soviet Union fell, Boris Yeltsin, that they had no intention of suddenly converting the Warsaw Pact countries into NATO countries. That was a promise that they made. It was Clinton, and then later Bush, and then Obama, who decided that let's go ahead and make all these countries NATO. Now, you may wonder, maybe that was just, now they could be part of our club. Okay, then why not make Russia part of the club? North Atlantic Treaty Organization, suddenly you got this northern alliance of countries that if any other country attacks them, then everyone will kind of go in for each other and help each other. No, that was not the intention. And I always wondered this when communism fell in the 90s. I was wondering, why doesn't the U.S. develop a really strong partnership with the emerging democratic forces within Russia? And yet I saw them being completely ignored. It was like having a neighbor who was having a problem. Their car's broken down, their house is on fire, and everything's going wrong. And then you just standing there and watching and commenting, but doing nothing about it to help. Or maybe, worse yet, maybe just sending a friend over who is trying to sell them something, but not actually trying to help them and saying, hey, let's get along with each other. Let's put all the years of animosity aside, and let's build a strong working relationship. And I didn't see that taking place. I had some hopes under George Bush, that when he said that he really liked Putin, that when Putin came to power, about the same time Bush did, and that he saw him as a friend and he knew he was a good person. The thing is, I thought something good was going to happen. But then something weird happened. Of course, that was 9/11. But now let's go back to the original premise. In the 90s, under Clinton, and who knows who was really running things in. Was it Bill or was it Hillary? I heard that Hillary actually had a lot to do with bombing Kosovo. Bill didn't really want to do it. But anyway, that's up for, analysis and speculation and so forth. The thing is that there were large corporations that could benefit if all of the Eastern Bloc nations had to join NATO, because then they would have to get updated weapons and so forth from large corporations in Western Europe and the United States. So there was an economic advantage to making Poland and Hungary and all these other countries into NATO partners. It wasn't just let's be stronger. Russians got to come and get us. What? Russia couldn't govern itself back in the 90s. Russia couldn't have taken over, the Falkland Islands or something like that. The thing is that NATO expanded into these regions, and the Russians really couldn't do much about it. But now, then you enter this new phase during, the early 2000s, 14 years ago, in which Putin was able to use his power and charisma in order to kind of get the country going. He went after a lot of corruption. Does that mean that the people that were running, the forces behind him were not corrupt? No. Okay? Things happen. It's just like saying, well, in America, are our senators and congressmen corrupt? Of course they are. It's weird how they get into power and all of a sudden they're worth millions of dollars on a congressman's salary. Okay? It might not be illegal corruption, but it's connections. And that was probably true too of Russia. But anyway, Putin was able to make the country work. And that's why so many people in Russia love Putin. Been to Russia many times. People really, really like. I don't think I've ever met anyone in Russia that did not like Putin. Okay? I seriously didn't. Except a couple expats. They're Americans. And they're like, I don't like Putin. But, who cares what they think? Russians like him. Now, the thing is that if we take a look at what's happened, though, is as Russia's economy has gotten better, as the people are enjoying a better standard of living, and Russia has looked at the West and noticed this encroachment, that all of a sudden they have borders where NATO, what was its original goal? To stand up to the Soviet Union, which many people in their minds, of course, translate out to Russia. Okay? Since what is now Russia proper was the major unit of the Soviet Union. Now, the thing is, they see this as a threat. And so Putin has been trying to modernize his military and get it more advanced. He's been trying to get more of a relationship with Europe. Now, the thing is that as Russia becomes more of a large trading partner for Europe, more of an energy supplier for Europe, that means it gets more money. That means it can put more money into its research and development for peaceful and weapons purposes. So therefore, what you have is Russia emerging as a power again. Now, there is a doctrine in the United States called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. And what it spells out, ultimately, is that any country that looks like it could be a rival in the way that the Soviet Union was up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, that everything should be done to prevent that from happening. Now, that's a really weird doctrine. I've asked people to look that up. Look up Wolfowitz Doctrine. Just Google it. And people are like, whoa, wait a minute. Does this mean that America wants to have total control over the whole world with just weak countries basically having to say yes to whatever it wants? Well, in a kind of a way it does. In a way it does say that the U.S. wants to be the number one superpower and no one else be able to threaten it. Now, this is kind of worrisome in many respects. If our policies today that are aimed at Russia are basically based at least philosophically on this Wolfowitz doctrine, then that means that we are heading to a clash with them. That would be like having let's use another analogy. That would be like there's a bully next door. Okay? He works out on his weights every day, and, he's kicked sand in your face a few times and, mocks you all the time. And he notices that you're out running, and then you get home and you start working on some weights and stuff. And every day as you get bigger and stronger, he just starts looking more menacing, because he's going, well, that guy could someday face me if I choose to face him. And every day he just gets a little bit more menacing, because he doesn't want you to be equal to him in strength. Now, then maybe you start doing dirty tricks. You come out, let's just say you're in Arizona and you have your weight set outside, or you come out the next day and someone's vandalized your weights, things like that. Now think about it. There's no way that you could say that America will be the number one, everyone has to bow to us, superpower, and then other countries start to grow in strength. And if that being the case, what then about China? Let's say America knocks out China. I mean, not China, but Russia. Let's say in some way, who knows, maybe some of those conspiracy theories that the Ukrainians shot down the airplane that was flying over Ukraine, I forgot the name of it there, the Malaysian airline, that they shot it down thinking that was Putin's plane, which was kind of weird that it did look similar and it had been flying in that area earlier, that they thought that they were going to shoot down Putin. Let's say they were successful, and then it causes turmoil, and Russia, for some reason or another, kind of falls apart on itself. And everything goes back into disarray, and Russia winds up the way it was back in the 90s. Well, that leaves China. Well, and China's advancing fast. Hardworking people. They have resources. Of course, they need resources, which means they're competing with the United States for resources. Russia's not competing with America for resources. Okay? That's not the deal. China, on the other hand, is in Africa trying to get more contracts for resources. China is fighting for oil. If you want to watch a really good documentary, I think it's actually made by France, but it's in English. Look up The Battle for Oil, the U.S. versus China. It's about 5 years old, but everything's pretty, still the same, pretty up to date. China and the United States are really in a battle for resources. And it's not just for the United States. America could become self-sufficient if it really wanted to. But America also has its puppet states, or allies, whatever you want to call them, in Europe. And, I think there could be a valid point made that the U.S. is so strong as an entity that it can force the European countries, even as a EU, which is not it's not a country, it's an entity, but it's not a country, but they force the various members of the EU to go along with whatever policy it wants. Therefore, that does render them, in some sense, a puppet state. They need to make sure that those NATO countries have adequate supplies of oil as well, and not just from Russia. So if oil being produced in China or in not China, but in Africa or Venezuela or Iran or places like that, if you want to make sure that these countries around the world are going to keep the oil flowing and it's going to be manageable by the West, then you're going to have a competition between China and the United States. In fact, Libya may have been based solely on that factor. Now, oh, come on. For years, Muammar Gaddafi had spouted off against the United States, okay? It was like a ritual. I mean, he'd go out, say something, man, the United States is this and this and this. But then he worked with them. I mean, he was involved with the CIA in these programs to go after Islamic terrorists. He benefited from it because he didn't want these terrorists, many of them coming from Benghazi, to have any power because he saw them as a threat. And many of the people that were in the forefront of these foreign mercenaries killing American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were not Iraqis, they were not Afghans, they were from countries like Libya. That's where they were getting their training. Why is ISIS so good at what they're doing? Okay, a little fast forward there. Why is ISIS so good? Because they have commanders with experience. Why? Because they were out there fighting the Americans. That's where they get their experience. So ironically, we were funding the people that were killing American men and women in Afghanistan and Iraq. We were helping many of these people who were the commanders of these forces going after Gaddafi. And then when Gaddafi was gotten rid of, then they could concentrate on Syria. But now, why was it that Gaddafi got in trouble with the world? I mean, not the world, but with the United States and Britain and France. Well, you can spout off a lot about the imperialist West, okay, and how decadent and all these other things they are. But then Gaddafi did a few things wrong. First of all, he gets up and criticizes at the United Nations, he criticizes the UN for being a bunch of hypocrites. Okay? That may have kind of given people a bad taste in their mouth. Now, what he said, was it true or not? I don't know. Look it up. You can look it up. It's still out there on YouTube. Just type in Gaddafi addresses United Nations. And he railed on the United Nations for being hypocrites. Then, what's kind of interesting, was Gaddafi came out and started talking about creating an African Union in which he would give money to countries that could show transparency and lack of corruption. He would help them in order to build their infrastructure up and emulate something similar to the European Union in hopes that the African nations could then advance themselves. And for some reason, Gaddafi was really saw himself as like this savior of Africa. If you look in his Green Book, you can get that online too, the Green Book. He goes through his various theories of the future. One of them is that Africa will someday dominate the world. And if you look at populations of North and South America are on the decline. Asia will be on the decline in just a couple decades. Europe, going out of business sale. No one's having kids. Even the Middle East, there is a decline in the birth rate. Many Middle Eastern countries have a negative birth rate. But Africa will grow by the end of this century to 4 billion people. Now, Gaddafi thought that, well, let's make sure Africa has some power. But that was not the big thing that got rid of Gaddafi. Gaddafi came out and started talking about selling his oil to China and also requiring oil, that instead of using the dollar, he would demand gold payments for his oil. And he would encourage other states to start doing the same thing. Well, that's a double whammy. First, you're starting to say, let's go to a gold standard. Okay, Gaddafi wanted the gold standard. I'm not one of these people that talks a lot about gold and silver standards and stuff like that. But it is interesting that he actually was like, yeah, let's go gold standard. He also wanted to get rid of the petrodollar. Okay, now that's a bad one. Oh man, that's not a good thing there. The U.S. if the petrodollar were to suddenly go out and all these countries started trading in their own currencies, or they chose the Chinese yuan or something like that to trade in, or the European euro, the Walmart will be a place you will window shop. Okay, you won't be able to afford to go to Walmart. And just look that up. Just look up what would happen to the currency. And that is why Gaddafi basically signed his death warrant. But that hurt the Chinese, because the Chinese were working along with developing the Libyan oil and other minerals and resources and so forth. Africa has like over 1 million Chinese citizens there working on various projects. And America does not necessarily see that as a good thing, because even without Russia, China has already, surpassed the United States when it comes to the size of an economy, and could someday become a rival to the United States. So what are you going to do about that? Well, that means, it could be that some of the stuff about Obama wanting to put more bases out into the Pacific and so forth, but this is part of this policy of containing China. Well, China doesn't have any real territorial ambitions. I mean, if they want something, they go out and buy it. I mean, they're buying up real estate from everywhere from California to Detroit. But the thing is that the United States does not want China to wind up all that powerful too. And also the connection between Russia and China and India and Brazil, that must really cause a lot of sweating in various boardrooms of the United States, as well as congressional halls and the White House. So the thing is that all of these kinds of policies, going after Putin because of Syria. I mean, Putin is just fun. Putin and Assad, and Assad before him, had the Russians and the Alawites and the moderate Muslims in Syria have had a working relationship for decades. And if Washington can overthrow Assad, kick the Russians out of their military base they have on the Mediterranean, that would be a huge blow for the Russians. Now, Putin was able to prevent the bombing of Assad 1 year ago to this date. November, December 2013 was when, the whole thing about we're going to go after Assad. And that was before ISIS. Then ISIS conveniently comes along. Interesting in and of itself. But the thing is that Russia stood in the way and succeeded against Obama, and Putin's popularity was very high. Putin was seen as the strong man. Obama was seen as weak. But then, again, another coincidence. Gosh, we keep coming up with these coincidences, ISIS, and then all of a sudden, Ukraine starts falling apart. The pro-Russian government that had been elected gets ousted. And you can look up that one. That's a really interesting story there in and of itself. But the thing is that Washington is now using this Ukraine situation. Again, remember, Ukraine is not only, Ukrainians and Russians are ethnically pretty much the same. The Russian civilization, if you want to call it that, started in Ukraine, thanks to a certain part to the Swedish Vikings who came in and organized things. But these countries are very close. Ukraine itself, though, as a territory, has gone between Russia and other, Ukraine and other entities for centuries. And that's why you have such a mix of people in the country. Some, again, ethnically, not a big difference. But culturally, some Ukrainians are Catholic in the West, and they speak Ukrainian. Some Ukrainians in the East most are Orthodox, and they speak Russian. And in the middle, they're all mixed up. Ukraine is not a country, it's two countries, if you want to look at it that way. And this crisis is being exploited tremendously. And when you get something that comes along like this House resolution, again, you can look it up, House Resolution 758, when you get something like that come along, what do you think the results are going to be? Russia and China are going to build stronger ties with each other. Russia is going to see its relationship to the West as adversarial, and they're not going to be able to trust the West anymore. If you don't think that Russia is going to start building bigger and more advanced weapons, think again. They're going to. And China's not stupid. They're not going to just sit back and go, whoa, what happened, when it's their turn. They are also going to start building more on their weapons and their development of higher technology and so forth. And what we may be seeing is a return. Within 10 years, we'll have, again, another Soviet Union-ish type, Russia, China alliance with their allies and the West with their allies facing off. Who benefits? I'll tell you who's going to benefit. The people that make money. Okay? Wall Street, the banking industry, all the companies that are associated with the surveillance state. That's billions and billions of dollars there. The ones that are associated with military contracts, all of these kinds of things are going to benefit tremendously. It's going to be, if you want money, go into these kinds of areas. You'll make it. And I think ultimately that is what the purpose of this is. The U.S. doesn't manufacture hardly anything anymore, aside from, waste paper recycling, pornography, and weapons. That's pretty much what we've got, as our big manufacturing things that make us unique. So, I would encourage people to start questioning this whole paradigm that's being pushed on us by the media right now and from the politicians. The ones that are like, we must hate Russia, we must hate Russia. And pretty soon it'll be, we must hate China, we must hate China. And is it just like 1984? This year we're at war with East Asia, and next year we're at war with Oceania, and it's just part of the, whatever, gets the profits up and uses the resources and that sort of thing. I don't think that's really the economy we really want to pass on to our children, is it? Or in the future we want to pass on? Because in this modern era, the weapons that are coming, when we start developing things like nanotechnology that could extend our lives hundreds of years, or it could be used to erase us, literally, I think I'd rather go for the peaceful and cooperative future, if anything else. So anyway, just a few thoughts I wanted to leave you there on current politics today in the United States and the world. Thank you for tuning in to Unlock the Door Radio, and I encourage you to tune in next week. Thank you.